The first question that I have is just who you are, and what you do, and what your background is.
Yeah, my name is Fidel Acosta. The Yupa call me Küpa. I am an independent militant from the left in different aspects. I have been the last 10 years with the Yupa people, fighting with them for their rights, the right to land, to education, dignity, health, access to the wealth of Venezuela. And yeah, I started to meditate 10 years ago, no, more, with Sabino Romero. I was organizing in some school in Caracas, and I radicalized very quickly, uh, looking at the injustice. And also, I consider myself in a context of an historical context of the Bolivarian Revolution. And I feel very glad to live such a historical moment like this one we are living right now.
So, can you just give a little bit of context of where the Yupka's territory is, and kind of the general history of how they were removed and how they had their territory taken?
Yeah, the Yupa are people of they are located in the west of the country, in the border with Colombia. They are Carib people, not exactly Caribbean. There is a linguistic confusion there. They are Carib people, like the Caribs that fight against the colonizers when they came 5 centuries ago. The Caribs people are known for being very, for being a people of warriors. For the struggle is very uh, iconic in the context of the colonization. And the Caribbeans were in the whole coast of Venezuela, and they were killed in the genocide. And the Yupas took the Sierra as a geographical fortress, and they resist in that zone the last 200 years. And in the first half of the 20th century, the landowners, with the support of those governments of those times in Venezuela, started to penetrate the Sierra, the plain lands, very rich lands, and started to massacre the Yupa people again. That happens in the 40s, 50s of the past century.
So, you mentioned the Yukpa leader, Sabino Romero. And one could argue that he staged a 21st century indigenous rebellion. Who is Sabino Romero, and what is his legacy in terms of its relationship to the Bolivarian Revolution?
Sabino Romero is a Yuapu, how they call him, a great leader. He led the recovery of important amount of land, and he put in the national context the thing of the land, of the indigenous land. And he was killed, he was murdered by landowners, but before they killed him, he recovered a lot of lands, a lot of former ranch that were originally from the Yupa. And he was a symbol of what is to be a revolutionary, the struggle of land a symbol for equity, equity in the access for the land and the rights. And Sabino Romero is a nightmare for the landowners in the west of Venezuela. A nightmare, and it's pretty alive in the indigenous people.
So can you talk a little bit about, like, he was assassinated in 2013, is that correct?
Correct.
And it was 3 days before Chavez had died or succumbed to cancer.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, people compare the two, Chavez and Sabino. What was their relationship?
Well, I remember when Sabino died, I was in Caracas painting some walls with spray. Sabino lives. I got the notice of Chavez, of the death of Chavez. So I have to write. That was like a highlight from my past. Sabino Chavez lives. Chavez was a historical condensation of many things, many things, and Sabino found Sabino feel represented by Chavez, and Chavez understood also the historical character of the Sabino struggle. So they are very close. In Sabino always, when he recovered the land, he always named Chavez. If you are messing with me, you are messing with Chavez. So there is no dissonance between those characters, I think. And Chavez, for the indigenous people, it's a very important symbol because our constitution that was signed 22 years ago include a chapter only for indigenous rights, the chapter 8. And that chapter provides the legal frame for the struggle. In some way legitimate from the point of view of the state, the struggle of the indigenous people. So it's very symbolical that they both died in March, 3rd of March and 5th, right?
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about the constitutional framework? Because under Chavez, there was also a lot of land and territory returned to indigenous people. But it wasn't just the state coming in and saying, here's the land back. The movements like Sabino, they fought for that land.
Exactly. Yeah. The Constitution, it's like an ocean, a principles, a list of principles. But to make a practice, it must be first laws, not only with the Constitution. And the laws must have like regulations to apply those laws. So in the indigenous topic, it was difficult, and those laws came very late. So with in the constitutional frame, Sabino started to fight, right? And when the father of Sabino was killed, Jose Manuel Romero, Chavez noticed. Chavez knew what was happening and created a kind of presidential commission to address the conflict and to buy the land for the landowners. Some part of the left questioned the decision of buy the land, because buying, you are recognizing that it's from them. But in any case, it was a recognition, right? Yeah. Okay. And yeah, Sabino was left outside the demarcation. It's terrible because he started the demarcation in the Sierra. He called it auto demarcation, self demarcation. But the Presidential Commission left him outside.
Why?
Because the local authorities of the region didn't understood the character of Sabino, and Sabino didn't obey any authority, so they didn't like to dialogue with Sabino. And it was sad that they left him outside the demarcation. But Sabino still supporting Chavez with any doubt. There is any doubt that the Yupas were with the government and with Chavez.
And there seems to be a debate about the legacy of Sabino, because some people will say that he was more of an anti-statist or like an anarchist. Others would say that he was more Chavismo, and he would even say that himself. Can you talk about that debate and why it's important?
Yeah. The thing is that the first anti-state was Chavez himself. Chavez is a paradoxical character too, in that sense. So in that frames of revolution, of try to dismantle the colonial bourgeois state, Sabino was anti-state. But Sabino is not an anarchist at all. Sabino also demands the presence of the state in the Sierra through food plans, health plans, education plans, and the institutions of the state with respect for the autonomy. But some people try to project their desires into the Yupa reality and try to associate them with Zapatista, for example. But the Yupa process is sui generis, like we say in Venezuela. So, yeah, and Sabino was an antagonist. Sabino was an enemy for the colonial structures inside the Venezuelan state, right? Because this is a contradictory state. It's not a magical state that, forget all the colonial centuries of colonial structures. And in that sense, he has many fights with the local regional authorities. Actually, he was killed by cops, for example, for cops from the region. That is the colonial structures I'm talking about. And Sabino represented, I think, the spirit of the Bolivarian Revolution and the Chavism. But that's only my opinion, because also the Chavism is a confluence of many different currents. Some talk about bourgeois revolutionary, a revolutionary bourgeois. It has no sense.
Like a revolutionary ruling class.
Exactly. And I don't know, that's not possible in Venezuela. But again, this is a dialectical process, this is a contradictory process, and we must not be surprised by it. We must keep fighting, continuing the legacy of Sabino, continuing the I don't know how to say it, to keep working for the rights for the people in many aspects. Land the land right is very important because it's the first one. Without land, you don't have anything. Schools, hospitals, you need a soil to build them. So that's the importance.
And so, in some ways, like the revolutionary process here has been different in other kind of revolutionary contexts. Like the Russian Revolution basically took state power, but then tried to destroy the bourgeois state through, armed struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And the Cuban Revolution, like other revolutions in the past, but the path to revolution in Venezuela has been different. It's been like democratic through electoral processes. Not to say that the other ones weren't, but it's taken a different path.
Mm-hmm.
And so on one hand, you do have the remnants of like a bourgeois institution, culture, behavior,
Mm-hmm.
but also on the other hand, you have the kind of colonial mentality of a lot of these institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And so how have indigenous movements, campesino movements, Afro-descendant movements, all kind of different social sectors address the question of decolonization?
Yeah, difficult question. It's not, you don't see that in the empirical reality.
Mm-hmm.
You see that through the conflicts that took place in Venezuela. For example, the killing of campesino and their demands. For example, the Sabino conflict. It's clear to explain that. I think when I think about this, I made the difference because, for example, if a right-wing government come to power, the former landowners will take back their land. Right now, they cannot. They simply cannot. They don't feel enough empowered to do it. But in a change of government, they will do it. So, but at the same time, this government doesn't fully support that radical spaces that are emerging in some places of the territory. There are tensions. For example, the Maisal commune. They win some election. Well, this not in this election. That happens like 4 years ago. They won the election, and they didn't recognize them as a force. So there is a contradiction, but that's good. In final terms, that's good. It's when I see the situation in Colombia, in Brazil, I know that we are in the right path in some way. That doesn't mean that that I myself am happy with what's happening. Killings of indigenous leaders like Sabino and many more in 1 year. We lost like 13 comrades in...
From landowners?
Yeah, exactly. The landowners killed them. Selective. And the same with campesinos. The same with some leftist leaders that were denouncing corruption. But in the international context, we must right-wing government came into power will be terrible for some progressive sectors that have gained some power.
Mm-hmm. So you use like a materialist analysis to look at these situations. I think sometimes there tends to be an over-romanticization of indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
And how in your work do you combat that? Like, how do you ground your analysis and the research you do with the Küpa people, but also in understanding this kind of dialectic between the state and social movements?
My first principle in my praxis is to not introduce a contradiction, even if I want to the contradiction in the field. I don't introduce it. The people itself, the reality, introduce the contradictions, and one must work on those contradictions that the people indicates. So, for example, the land recovery has some high points in some moments, and then in some years it's more calm and quiet, and one must understand that and try to not lose perspective and think in historical terms and in long terms. So one must not desperate. And in another way, one must preserve the force one can gain. So preserve the life of the comrades, form the study for the future, form new leaderships with education, and the cultural. There is an interesting revitalization of indigenous culture in Venezuela, specific in the Sierra, where I have worked. But I don't deny that in other spaces it's happening the same thing. So we must preserve those things and not be only drive by the immediate things. And that's the analysis of the right wing of the things. You know, they say we have an epidemic of malaria, for example, and they blame the government instantly. And many fail in that analysis and that way of see things. And it should not be that way. One must be with the people, projecting the desires of the people, and try to find a methodological and a correct way to do it.
You're a young person and you're involved in these movements. You're younger. I don't know how old you are. I'm assuming in your 20s.
24.
24.
Mhm.
So you don't remember like the Caracas.
No, I have heard.
Do you think that there is a transference of those kind of moments in a revolutionary sense to the younger generation? And what do youth mobilizations look like?
The knowledge of the past and the perception of the past, it's very conflictive, because we have very difficult times in the 20th century. But then we have abundance, like wealth, like immense, a huge amount of dollars through the oil rent. So that implies a change of the culture. Many youth don't see the past as rougher than now. And some say we are living the worst moment in Venezuelan history. That's not true. But the reality is still very, very fucked up. So how do you deal with that? And that's the question of praxis. How do you deal with all those contradictions? And yeah, the PSUP has put a huge amount of youth in their leaderships through their institution, and that's very good. And in Venezuela also, a lot of youth have flee from the country, because they were. It's different, because the thing with Venezuela is that inside Venezuela you can have many different realities. Some say Venezuela has all the historical times that has been, the indigenous, then the rural, then there are some cities that has a American culture very internalized, and you have all of that in the same country. So yeah, one must analyze the youth in different aspects. As I say, in the city, I see too much apathy for some part of the youth. But the youth of the Chavism is taking the spaces because they were formed to do it. And the opposition, it's in its work, in its worst moment right now. Totally. And the Guaido was the last hope of some sector, but they are dead now. So I think the scenario that are in the future, it's going to be very interesting. We're going to see how contradictions get higher, because you have all this thing of bourgeois revolution with the campesinos, and the crisis is going to end on some point. We are working so hard to lift the sanctions, and the sanction strategy has failed. It's going to end on some point. So what's going to happen? What are we going to do? The revolutionary forces in this moment. It's something that we must answer with in the praxis.
So where do you see the role of like indigenous movements in all of this? Because you look at Venezuela, you look at Ecuador, Bolivia and Ecuador have plurinational constitutions. Venezuela doesn't call itself a plurinational state, but it has some characteristics, And I think, having visited Bolivia and Ecuador and seeing the limitations of certain forms of, constitutionalism, but also the possibilities that the movements that brought those things into power provide, like, where does that leave, like, the Venezuelan movements?
The indigenous movements' role in the Bolivarian Revolution, I think it's to help us to understand another way to understand the relations we have with work, with land, with knowledge, with authority. And that's a strategical way to see it. A more practical way is to have a representation in instance in the space of power, like a National Assembly. In the Indigenous has a ministry, the Ministry for the Indigenous People. I think what the Ministry of the Indigenous Ministry, what they have to say is very important, because they are like the formal politic of the state to the indigenous. And it has been, I evaluate it in two aspects. One, in the dimension of reivindication and speech, and knowledge has been pretty good, because we have very progressive and even radical norms in education, intercultural education. But in the plane of the praxis, it's contradictory, and there is a way to do the politics, to do the politics in Venezuela, that consider the indigenous as I don't know how to say it in English. Because you have to distribute the oil rent, and you destinate a small part for the indigenous people. So all that has to do the state is to distribute that small part in their land, and that has produced a dependence of the state. And when the state collapsed and the oil price get to the ground, many communities suffered too much because they were expecting food boxes and many reivindication that they obviously deserve. But that way to administrate the state wasn't sustainable in time. So I don't know if I answered your question kindly. It's a very broad topic.
I mean, there's a lot of contradictions, like you said. Like, so for example, in the southern state, I just spoke with Ariasa about this because he was a minister of mining in the mining arc in the southern part of Bolivar. And he worked with a lot of indigenous communities, but during the really high points of the crisis, all the industries really collapsed. The economies collapsed. And so many of the indigenous communities who, like you said, depended on the oil rents, depended on, subsidized housing, roads, infrastructure, all that stuff, were the last to receive anything. And so many turned to illegal mining.
Yeah.
And so it created this.
It's the same way now.
Yeah.
We have an epidemic of malaria and leishmaniasis, tuberculosis in the Sierra. And it's relatively simple to address the problem and solve it. But it's the last way to achieve the oil rent. So it's difficult, and that's more a discussion that has to do with the state. In Venezuela, usually the politics are state-centric. Everything depends on how you distribute oil rent, and we must, as Venezuelans, go to another kind of society. We must overcome the rentism and overcome the underdevelopment. And the Indigenous has a lot to aportar, help to with that, because in some aspects there are some communities that didn't get in the rentism logic, and that's very valuable in this context. And it's the same context of very poor communities that we have. So the revolutionary answer to that is that we, the poor indigenous workers, miners, students, we must organize in a force in some way. Some say inside the Chavismo, and I think it's possible. It's difficult, but in any way, I think we must try to do less state-centric politics and less electoral politics. The electoral are a necessity, but it's sad that a politic goes to indigenous community only in the elections to get to deliver some food, some pair of things, and he doesn't appear the rest of the year. That should not happen. So we have to, and we as revolutionaries have tried to also, we are helping that way to understand politics, focusing everything on the state and the elections.
And also it goes back to land, because the country has to diversify its economy. it's being forced to because of sanctions. Because there's no future for oil. And so what does a post-oil Venezuela look like?
We must discover it. There is in this context, there is something that some argument against the indigenous land recovery is that the indigenous are not productive as the landowners are. That's a strong argument, right? In a moment of crisis that you don't have food, you are going to stop a ranch that is producing milk and meat to give it to Indians that doesn't produce in the same levels, that doesn't create excedent,
or what are you trying to say?
That the indigenous land doesn't produce more. They produce only what they are going to consume.
Oh, it's sustainable versus like for profit.
Exactly.
Or surplus.
And yeah, exactly. The indigenous land doesn't produce the high amounts of meat and milk that produce the ranch. So the arguments we have in our favor is that in first place, that wealth that is produced doesn't mean that less inequality, for example. The other argument is that the landowners are very close to paramilitaries, to contraband of anything.
Smuggling.
Drugs, food, and gasoline. And the thing is, the recovery of the land can be used for get higher levels of life quality in the people, and that's very important. In that context, the another thing I wanted to say is that the land recovery was very chaotic, because the government paid the land with only that, and didn't think what was going to happen with that land, and it didn't follow what the indigenous peoples were, and the indigenous people claimed the president of the state, like, hey, I need your help. Some wanted to do housing, but the other ones wanted to keep the ranch working. But many want that to produce the land in higher levels, but that without the help of the state, it's very, very difficult, because that work with the capital of the landowners. So people, and the Yupas are hunters and gatherers, and they don't have a culture of monocultive, like many kilometers growing the same
crop.
Exactly. So that cultural change must be must be with the presence of the state in the land. And many of that ranch are broke right now. And the right wing blames the Yupas, like those savage took the land and broke it all. But they don't see, for example, when the landowner has a lot of paramilitaries in there. And look this, in 2007, many of the products of Venezuela flow to Colombia through the border. That's not the blame of the Yuppers are not to blame for that at all. The Yupas are like I don't know how to say it in English. They want to blame everything on them, everything bad that happens. So we must work on that too.
So, kind of just to bring it back to this question of Sandino, or excuse me, not Sandino. Sabino.
They're very close.
Yeah,
They're very close in many ways.
Yeah. But Sabino, and thinking about Marxism and socialism and communism, because oftentimes, I don't know what it's like here, but sometimes people say that socialism and communism and indigenous people are two separate issues.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, when I think about it, I think about how indigenous people lived in a non-capitalist way for a long time. I wouldn't call it socialist or communist quite yet, but their culture, that was their base, right? And the superstructure, they developed their culture, their language, their worldview, their spirituality, their understanding to live in reciprocity with the world. But the base, the economic mode, was destroyed and replaced by capitalism and exploitation. But nonetheless, indigenous people still retain the kind of non-capitalist culture and practice and belief. And to me, it only makes sense. Like after reading like Meriategui or something, it only makes sense that a kind of left politics perfectly aligns because it aspires to the values that indigenous people, many indigenous people, it's not the same, but many indigenous people still hold. You know, and so like, what is the role like of the indigenous question in the socialist revolution?
Exactly. That don't happens like in the paper. That happen in an ideal place.
Right.
That happens in a conflict, and you have landowners that want to kill people. What are you going to do? Organizing, and you take the state. I think must be in first place a dialogue between the state and the indigenous people inside the territory. Like, what do you want to do? What do you want me to do? And Chavez have that spirit in many ways. Like, tell me, what can I do? Let's build both indigenous and non-indigenous, the state and the people in its diversity, a new kind of society. In the ideal dimension, it's like that. But this, in the context of conflict, sometimes you don't have enough time and agreement with everyone to do it. But the indigenous people, some indigenous people, as you say, for example, Sabino, mark a way very clear against the private property of high amounts of land. And when I meet Sabino, we were talking to transcend the indigenous moment, and the discussion were with the peasants, with the campesinos too. So it's not only that for indigenous people, it's the whole society, because we're a whole. For example, the indigenous people territories are in a lot with resource under the soil. What are we going to do? We must dialogue with the communities. And in the Constitution, there is an article that says that the exploitation of the resource in the indigenous land is going to be only if they allow to.
Consent.
Exactly. And for example, Sabino always opposed to the exploitation of coal, and he stopped the exploitation, the open of new mines, because there are mines of coal, but the government hasn't opened new mines. and that was due to the strong militance of Sabino against the mines. Also, in this context, we have the penetrations of US imperialists. This leaked document of the CIA analyzed the situation of the Yucpas, for example, and their contradictions with landowners and the government and all this.
Was this through the WikiLeaks?
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, and it's a very complex because, from my point of view, the state must be there with the Yucpas, dialoguing, staying there all the time. And that's very difficult because that's a zone that historically has a very little presence of the state. And that results in all the things that happened in that zone, that it's very conflictive if you see what happens. You have presence of paramilitaries and many difficult things. So yeah.
So how is the spirit of Sabino alive today?
Right now we have occupied two former ranch, indigenous land. And the first thing that the Yucpa does with take the land is to name it. For example, there is a very important ranch that is in hands of the Yucpa that is called Chavismo. That means thanks to Chavez. And there is another one called Chactapa, for example. There is that means dry river. So anyway, there is many ways, and that is what Sabino, the method of Sabino. He take the land, make a new name, consulting the elders, and that's what the Yucpa is still doing in the present. And there is a conflict there. The conflict that Sabino is, I wouldn't say he began, because Sabino is in an historical and social current. We can frame it with all the class struggle in Venezuela, in Nuestra América or America. So yeah, that's the context we're moving in. And Sabino is an important reference, not only for indigenous people, but the whole left, at least the revolutionary left. It's very aware of the figure of Sabino.
So last question. What is one thing about Venezuela that you want the rest of the world to know?
One thing about Venezuela, that we are resisting the brutal attack of the United States imperialism, and it must to end because we are suffering it, and that's for all the global south. Two other countries are going through the same: Libya, Syria, Nicaragua, Cuba, China, and the US imperialism must end. We will end it.